Hello. So a grand total of 5 people asked me how I make my stick figures, and I thought I'd make a tutorial / process kind of video. I'm going to walk through my process of making this figure. Let's get it. Speaking head emoji. So the first thing I do is gather references. I generally just look on Pinterest because it usually has everything I need. I mainly picked out front-facing references because I'm not planning to 360 this figure. Now it's stick noding time. The first thing I do after importing my references is make a base for the body. I do this to loosely get the proportions down for when I trace over it. Here's how it looks _caret. Now I get in the stick making mode and I map out my joints for the figure. There's a reason why I do it with invisible nodes too, you'll see later. Now before we get to the tricky part, let me sidetrack for a moment here. I want to explain how stick making usually works. Most people use the draw tool to form the shape of whatever they're making. For instance, look at this really old figure I made. You can see it's mainly made up of ellipses, triangles, trapezoids and rounded segments. My new figures on the other hand, are made in a rather unorthodox way. Most of it relies on the polyfill feature. How does polyfill work? Well, this is how the app explains it. I personally use it like a bucket tool you might find in most drawing softwares. It has a bit more to it, but I like to keep it simple. Now as for how I actually make my figures. I usually make an outline using rounded segments or trapezoids and fill it in with polyfill. Seems simple enough, right? Well, not when you're making a whole figure plus adding useful mechanics. Anyway, let's get back to stick making. As you can see, I'm adding the outlines that I'm going to fill in later. Now it may not look like it, but this is one of those mechanics I was talking about. I call it the 3D thingy. The idea is to use curve nodes plus polyfill to make 3D adjustable joints by simply changing the curve value on a node. How I do this is by adding 2 segments on opposite sides from each other, adding connector nodes between both segments and filling it in with polyfill. And it's done. That's how it works in simple terms. Naturally it gets more challenging depending on the shape of whatever you're trying to make, or how many curved connector nodes it needs. It might seem a little tedious, but the payoff is worth it, because these figures will look flat and unrealistic without it. Trust me, your animations will look way better. Anyway, let's go back to the figure. I also got a few tips for doing the outline. Aside from the 3D thingy, what's going to help this stick figure move 3-dimensionally is Smart Stretch. It's gonna make all the segments move in tandem, but only inward and outwards, which is why when you build your outline you should always have the static nodes converging vertically, so the main joints can stretch effectively. Of course you could always just stitch using Smart Stretch like I typically do. I keep almost all the nodes visible and movable so I can have as much freedom as possible when animating, but it is way more tedious to use. I'm opting for a Smart Stretch method for this figure so it's easier to digest for viewers. Now for the next tip. It has to do with adding line weight to the outlines. Line weight is when the thickness of your lines vary. Take these 2 stick figures for instance. If you look very closely at the kilo figure you can see the thickness of the lines vary, unlike the Tifa one. Now my job isn't to explain why and when to use line weight. There are many YouTube art tutorials out there that would explain it way better than me. What I will show you though, are 2 methods to implement it into stick nodes. The easier way to implement it is to just use rounded segments like usual, except you change the thickness of some of them. You can also shift the layering of the polyfill layer to appear in front of other segments and in turn, make them look thinner. Now, a little more tedious way is to use trapezoids and to change the thickness, but make sure you select rounded trapezoids. This way is definitely better because the trapezoids can properly sink into each other, whereas the rounded segments don't really carry any flow between the lines. Line weight is optional though, you could always just go with none and it'll still look fine. That's what I'm doing for this Tiffa figure. Speaking of which, I finished the outlines for it, so it's polyfilling time. In making sure I carefully select my polyfill around the 3D thingy curved connector nodes. A quick tip: in case you got too many curved nodes in one spot, you can actually slide the connector's node across so it doesn't overlap with the others _caret. I also like to select my polyfills onto invisible nodes instead of visible ones, so that when I push the layering back I don't also push back a visible segment. Be precise and make sure you're polyfilling the right nodes, cause polyfills are a little glitchy, so if you do it wrong it might mess up part of the figure. Also, this is really tedious, but every time you make a polyfill you gotta make sure you change the curve precision to 5. I wish we could change what number to default it on, but we can't frown. I no longer have any polyfill wisdom to impart, so I'm gonna skip through this. Now I'm making the straps. All I gotta do is put a connector node between her belt and her shoulders. Fill it in with some polyfill. And we're done. Next I'm moving on to the arms. First I start off with the shoulder. I also noticed the shoulder won't lay below the torso properly, so I fixed that. Next I moved on to the top part of the arm. Nothing really complex happening here, just making sure I'm applying the 3D thingy. Same with the forearm. Moving on to the accessories. For the buckle, I made it with rounded segments and added outlines using connector nodes. I also made the strap and elbow pad on a separate invisible node so I can save it as a separate figure easier later on. And I'm done both arms. I'm gonna skip over me doing the legs cause there's not really any insight unique to the legs that I can give. I will briefly go over how I make the shoes though. As usual I'm sticking to the formula, building the outline with the 3D thingy and polyfilling it. The shoes probably have the most 3D thingy connector nodes out of all the individual parts of this fig. They are also a little harder to make seem convincingly 3D with the smart stretch approach, but mostly when they're at a 3/4 angle or side, which I won't be covering in this video. I may make some separate tutorials in the future and go fully in depth for specific parts on figures. Anyway, next I'm gonna do the shoelaces. I like to have the length of them be adjustable, so I usually make them on a movable invisible node and smart stretch it. Done the shoes. Next is the head. There's nothing particularly complex about the head. Just shape it and use connector nodes to bridge the hairline across. The hair can also be relatively simple depending on how you approach it. I have two ways that I do it. The first is to have every hairpiece be disconnected from the others and be completely movable. All you need to do is create a circle using a rounded segment with 0 length. Trust me, it's easier than using the actual circle tool. Add an invisible segment going up and the hair segments going down onto the circle. Polyfill it and you're done. A small tip in case you want to keep the hair parts from appearing completely disconnected is to add a polyfill throughout all of the hair nodes. It doesn't exactly look the best, but it keeps them connected at least greater than _ less than. Now for the second method, and the one I'm using for this Tiffa figure. The idea is to use an invisible node plus segment to lay out strands for the hair, and to use connector nodes to connect each segment to the next invisible node. This way there are no gaps in the outline. If you're looking for completely clean hair outlines, this way definitely works out better. From there I make the top part of the hair, the back, and I'm done. Now it's time to make the eyes. First I'm making the eyelashes for the upper eyelid out of trapezoids on an invisible node so I can move it around freely. Then I move on to the lower eyelid. I make it disconnected from the invisible node controlling the upper eyelid. I added a connector between them so when I move the upper eyelid around it follows the movement. Adding some details. After that I move on to the pupil. I know some people like to build the pupil vertically with smart stretch, but I think it works better when you build it horizontally. You get to create better looking perspective shots. After that I make the eyebrow. Now I'm building a layer of polyfill around where the eye whites are going to be. I'm adding this so the pupil can stay layered below the skin. After that I add the eye whites, and I'm done. BTW, I recommend keeping almost every node visible on the eye. I think it's good to have them as flexible as possible. It's not too hard to get used to either _ caret. After that I split up all the figures into different parts. I then assemble them and add a circle with an outline at the end of the joints so it connects properly. It's better for the layering when it's a separate figure. And it's finally done, yippee. Wait. There's one final step, actually. Make sure you practice and have fun _ caret. BTW, I will be linking the figures used in this video in a Google Drive file down in the description, for study or whatever. That is all. Goodbye.